The sun was a molten disk hanging low in the sky, turning the horizon into a blazing stretch of orange and crimson that reflected off the dust rising from the plains. The air was heavy with the scent of dry grass, sweat, and the faint tang of livestock. The ranch stretched out before Amelia like an endless, sun-bleached expanse, each fencepost and barn beam catching the dying light in harsh contrast. She stood at the edge of the corral, her hands shaking as they clutched a folded letter. The paper was crumpled from days of being handled, the ink smudged from nervous fingertips in the heat of the afternoon sun, but its contents weighed heavier on her than the heat pressing down on the earth around them. She had waited for him here, pacing the worn wooden planks of the barn's edge, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Her chest heaved with each breath, more from anticipation than exertion. When Jacob, Red, Callahan finally appeared at the edge of the corral, he looked like he belonged to the land itself. Broad-shouldered, sun-browned, with hair like scorched wheat curling at the nape of his neck. He was the kind of man who made people turn and look when he walked, not because he demanded attention but because his presence carried the weight of authority and danger alike. Amelia's voice cracked as she stepped toward him, her desperation spilling into the wide, empty air. Just do it already, she whispered. Her eyes, rimmed with red from sleepless nights, locked onto his. You know it's the only way. Jacob's hand hovered near his side, brushing against the coarse leather of his belt. He didn't move toward the barn, didn't reach for the crate hidden in its shadow. His jaw clenched, a muscle pulsing in the side of his face. He had wrestled with this decision for weeks, long nights spent staring at the ceiling of his small cabin, listening to the distant howls of coyotes and wondering how far he could push himself before the law or the townsfolk came down on him. He had always been a man who measured risk, who knew the pulse of the land and the people on it. But this was something that had no precedent, something that wasn't just about surviving the next storm or keeping his cattle from stampeding. Amelia stepped closer, her boots scuffing the dry soil. If you don't, she said, her voice breaking, they'll destroy everything. I can't watch them take it from us. Not again. Her hands found his forearms, gripping tightly, desperate to anchor him to reality, to force him to act before fear stole him completely. Jacob's eyes darted toward the barn, to the crate hidden in shadow, knowing it contained everything that could bring down the corrupt sheriff and the wealthy landowners who had strangled the town under the guise of law and order. The letters, the receipts, the ledgers, they were all there. Evidence that could free not just his ranch, but perhaps others like him. But exposing it meant painting a target on his back. The law would come for him. The men with flintlocks, torches, and righteous fury would come. And he could not guarantee he would walk away alive. Amelia, he began, his voice low, roughened by long days of dust and sweat. You don't understand what happens when he stopped, swallowing hard. There was no avoiding the truth now. They both knew it. The sheriff would see this as a betrayal, as a challenge to his authority, and he would act with fire and steel. I'm not sure I'm ready for what comes next. Her eyes glistened, tears catching the dying light like small flames. You're the only one who can, Red, she said. Her grip tightened, knuckles whitening. I've tried, I've begged, I've gone to them myself, and it's no use. You're the only one with the guts to see this through. Jacob's hand finally rested on the edge of the barn door, brushing against the rough wood as though seeking courage from the familiar texture. He drew a deep, shuddering breath, the kind that makes the chest ache and the lungs burn. All right, he muttered, more to himself than to her, his voice a low growl of reluctant determination. Let's finish this. Together, they moved toward the barn. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, a chaotic rhythm that matched the nervous tremor in her hands. She could feel the weight of the decision settling on Jacob, a solid, unyielding weight that he carried as naturally as breathing. They stepped through the doorway, the smell of hay and dust mingling with the metallic scent of the crate within. Jacob crouched slightly, lifting the lid with a grunt, revealing the neatly stacked papers, bundles of letters tied with twine, and ledgers filled with meticulous handwriting. Amelia's fingers hovered over the documents, reluctant to touch them yet drawn irresistibly toward the truth they held. This will change everything, she whispered. Jacob nodded. It has to, he said. His eyes, dark and steady, met hers. If we don't, nothing ever will. The sky beyond the barn glowed with the last light of sunset, the horizon streaked with reds and purples that deepened into night. Jacob dragged the crate out into the open, the rough wood scraping against the dry earth. Amelia helped him steady it, and together they laid out the evidence for the townsfolk who had gathered slowly, curiosity bringing them out of their homes. The townspeople's eyes widened as the truth became visible, as the proof of the sheriff's corruption, of embezzlement and bribery, was revealed in plain sight. Gasps echoed across the square. Conversations died mid-word. Men and women who had always bowed to authority now looked at each other, seeing not just documents but the betrayal that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Amelia's hands shook as she passed papers to anyone who reached for them, her mind spinning with the enormity of what they were doing. Jacob stood at the edge of the square, the crate behind him, his shoulders squared and his chin lifted. He could feel the tension in the crowd, the mix of fear and hope radiating off them in waves. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to imagine a future where the sheriff's reign of greed and terror was over, where the small ranches, the town, and the people who had been crushed under the weight of corruption could breathe again. But the sound of hooves in the distance shattered that moment. A group of men, torches held high, rode fast across the plains, their shadows stretching long in the glow of the rising moon. Jacob's heart sank. The sheriff had already called for reinforcements, and the moment they saw the evidence, the law would descend upon them like fire on dry grass. Amelia's hand found his, gripping tightly. "Red, they're coming," she whispered, fear threading through her voice. He nodded once, resolutely. "I know." His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing under the sun-darkened skin. "We've already started. There's no turning back." The townspeople began to murmur nervously, some stepping back into the safety of shadows, others hesitating, torn between fear of authority and a desire for justice. Amelia's eyes met Jacob's again, and in that brief glance, he saw the unspoken plea, "Don't fail." Jacob's gaze swept the horizon. He could see the approaching riders, their torches a wave of amber fire cutting through the twilight. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, heavier than any fence, heavier than any herd of cattle he had ever managed. But he also felt something else, a fierce, unyielding resolve, a clarity he hadn't known in months of indecision. "Amelia," he said quietly, determination threading through the exhaustion in his voice. "Get ready. We're going to make them see. We're going to make them understand that truth isn't something to be hidden." Her hand squeezed his, and together they braced for what was coming. The first torches appeared over the ridge, their flames flickering like angry eyes. The law had arrived, and with it, the threat of fire and violence. But as Jacob looked out over the crowd, over the town he had called home all his life, he realized that fear was no longer the only force at work. Hope, fragile but fierce, had begun to spark among the people. He could feel Amelia's presence beside him, steadying him, grounding him in the moment. He drew a deep breath, the dry air burning his lungs, and squared his shoulders. The evidence was out. The truth was visible, and whatever came next, they had taken the first step. The first horseman reached the edge of the town square, and the sheriff's voice rang out, harsh and demanding. "Step away from that crate," he bellowed, flintlock in hand. "This is an unlawful act, and you will all pay for it." Jacob took a step forward, and Amelia moved with him, their hands brushing briefly. He raised a finger toward the crate, toward the documents that could topple a corrupt empire. "No," he said, voice low but unwavering. "This isn't unlawful. This is the truth." The shadows of the riders stretched across the square, their horses snorting and stamping. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and the dry plains into their noses. Jacob felt the first tremor of fear, a knot in his stomach, but it was tempered by the undeniable certainty that he had made the right choice. Amelia whispered, "Just, be careful," but she didn't step back. She didn't leave. She stayed by his side, a steady anchor in a world suddenly tipping toward chaos. Jacob glanced at her, a faint, grim smile breaking across his dust-streaked face. "We've got this far," he said, and the fire in his voice carried across the square, reaching ears that had only known obedience. "We've got to see it through." The sun had disappeared completely, leaving the town bathed in the ghostly glow of twilight. And though the sheriff and his men advanced, the people were watching now, and that alone was a weapon Jacob had not anticipated. Amelia's eyes met his again, and he saw hope there, fierce, unyielding hope. That hope, he realized, was worth every risk, every drop of sweat, every heartbeat of fear. They had begun something that could not be undone. The first torches reached the square, and the shadows of men and horses danced across the scattered evidence. But Jacob stood firm, Amelia at his side, the crate of truth between them, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause, waiting to see if courage could outweigh tyranny. The night had fully claimed the town, wrapping the wooden buildings and empty streets in a velvet darkness that seemed almost unnatural under the heat of the torches. Smoke from the barn fire curled into the sky, painting it with streaks of orange and black, and the crackle of flames echoed across the square. Jacob's lungs burned from exertion and the thick air of dust and smoke, but he didn't stop. He dragged the crate across the rough ground, the wood scraping and groaning beneath the weight, each step a reminder that there was no turning back. Amelia followed closely behind, her hands gripping the crate's edges, her boots leaving shallow impressions in the dry dirt. The sheriff's men had begun to circle the square, their faces half lit by torchlight, half hidden in shadow, but every motion exuded menace. Flintlocks were raised, bayonets glinting in the firelight, eyes hard and unyielding. The town had always feared them, and many had obeyed without question, but now, they hesitated. The evidence was laid bare, impossible to ignore. The letters, the ledgers, the documents spilling from the crate like fragments of a truth too long hidden. They shone in the firelight, and the townspeople could see the betrayal that had been stitched into the very fabric of their lives. Jacob paused for a brief moment, his chest heaving, sweat and soot streaking his face. "Amelia," he said, his voice low but urgent, "you've got to help them understand. Pass these to anyone who questions me." She nodded, her fingers trembling as she scooped up the documents. Her eyes darted to the sheriff's advancing men, then back to Jacob. "They'll kill you," she whispered, panic threading her words. "They won't care about the truth." Jacob's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Then let them try. I'm not stepping back. If we don't expose this now, they'll keep crushing everyone else. We can't let that happen." His voice was rough, hoarse from shouting across the square, yet it carried a weight that seemed to settle over the crowd. The people began to murmur, slowly at first, then louder, drawn out of fear by the raw determination in his words. The first of the sheriff's men stepped forward, torches held high, their boots thudding against the wooden planks of the square. "Step away from that crate, Callahan," one of them shouted, voice sharp, commanding. "You're under arrest for obstruction and defiance." Jacob didn't flinch. He planted himself firmly in front of the crate, his shoulders squared against the advancing men. "You're under arrest for theft, for bribery, for ruining the town," he said, voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. "This is the law you've been hiding, not the one you've been enforcing." Amelia's hands were shaking as she handed a stack of documents to an older man in the crowd, his face pale but resolute. "Read this," she said, urgency spiking her voice. "It proves everything. You know it's true." The man hesitated, eyes flicking between the papers and the approaching men with guns. Slowly, he took the evidence, and then others followed, snatching up letters, tying receipts together with twine, holding them aloft like talismans against the corruption they had endured for too long. The torches came closer, the firelight flickering across Jacob's face, illuminating the determination etched into his features. He could feel the heat on his back, the sound of horses stomping, the low murmur of voices behind the sheriff's men as they tried to intimidate the crowd. But there was no turning back now. The moment he had acted, the die had been cast. The sheriff's face appeared in the torchlight, twisted in fury. "Callahan, you dare defy me in your own town?" he bellowed, spittle flying from his mouth. "I will see you burned for this insolence." Jacob's gaze remained steady, unblinking. "Then do it," he said, voice a low growl. "Burn me if you must. But the truth doesn't die with me." He took